Prif Weinidog ac mae'r cwestiwn cyntaf gan John Griffiths.
Government to tackle air pollution in Wales.
Llywydd, the programme for government published today reiterates our commitment to a Clean Air Act for Wales. As early as this week, we will support and promote Clean Air Day Wales, raising awareness of air pollution and the part which each one of us can play to make the air cleaner and healthier.
First Minister, the impact of air pollution is very significant in terms of our health, as shown in asthma rates and other respiratory conditions, for example, and also with regard to environment and climate change. I know, First Minister, you are fully committed to radical and timely action for this Welsh Government, and that's certainly needed with regard to public health and our precious environment. We need to find practical and productive ways forward that have a real positive impact in our communities. And as far as air pollution is concerned, road traffic is quite a major part of the problem. The transition to electric vehicles will make a very welcome impact on these issues. And indeed, Newport Transport has a fleet of electric buses, which is a good example of progress. First Minister, will you look at Welsh Government schemes and support for the switch to electricity for vehicles for those most in use in our communities? Buses, taxis, local authority and local delivery vehicles as well.
Well, Llywydd, I thank John Griffiths for that supplementary question and, of course, agree with him about the significance of clean air to human health, to the environment, to biodiversity and indeed to our economy. The Welsh Government is investing nearly £30 million in electric and low-emission buses, in taxis and in improving our charging infrastructure, particularly in those places where people are most likely to be travelling, so at railway station car parks and public car parks. Our £4 million green taxi pilots have purchased 50 fully electric wheelchair-compliant taxis so that taxi drivers can take them on a use and decide basis so that they can see the advantages for themselves. And Llywydd, can I particularly commend the actions of Newport Council for the leadership they have shown with the extended flexi bus service that has recently been introduced. And on Thursday of this week, the Deputy Minister for Climate Change will be visiting Newport Council to celebrate the launch of their new active travel routes as part of Clean Air Day. And I know that that's going to take place at Llywodraeth, where the Council will be showcasing some of the 15 new electric buses which they have available as part of their electric vehicle fleet and which will help significantly to provide clean air for the citizens of Newport.
Janet Finch-Saunders.
Diolch Llywydd. I do find it somewhat amusing that John Griffiths, our colleague, speaks of early action on air pollution. As the First Minister and I know, he is already very late on this argument. In fact, in May 2019, he told the Senedd that this debate had been ongoing for a decade. And we all know that you, First Minister, have failed to deliver on your leadership promise, and I quote, to develop a new Clean Air Act. Now, whilst I appreciate that the responses to the white paper consultation are currently being reviewed, it does remain the case that we may not see regulations set until spring 2024. So I warn John Griffiths that positive action does seem set to be ever further delayed. However, turning to you, First Minister, there is a short-term step that you can take. The £3.4 million revenue funding and £17 million capital funding allocated for air quality action in 21-22 represents a real terms cut from the previous year. So will you undo this cut and invest further in tackling the world's largest single environmental health risk? Diolch Llywydd.
Well, Llywydd, despite the climate health emergency and the constraints that placed both on the Senedd in terms of legislation and on the Welsh Government's capacity, having had to divert significant resources to the burden of coronavirus legislation that has had to pass through the Senedd, we published our Clean Air Plan in August 2020. We published the Clean Air White Paper in January 2021. We published alongside it a consultation on reducing emissions from domestic burning of solid fuels, and we are responding now to the consultation, the significant replies to consultations which have come in from all parts of Wales, and I expect to be able to publish a summary of those responses in September. So, Llywydd, despite the fact that our capacity to move ahead with the clean air legislation that I had hoped we would be able to bring forward in the last Senedd term, we have been able to make significant steps ahead, and we will continue to invest. We'll continue to invest in the way I've already explained, in those practical actions that John Griffiths pointed to, that make a practical difference.
Delith Jewell.
Diolch, Llywydd. There is a street in my region in Hafod ar Ynys that's known as the most polluted street in Wales. The likelihood is that there are many other streets like that in Hafod ar Ynys, but we don't know about the pollution because the monitoring isn't there. Now, the Clean Air Act that you've mentioned, First Minister, that we all await, should provide an opportunity to increase air monitoring, to highlight the problem areas and to help get to grips with these issues to avoid other streets from choking in fumes from congestion and domestic burning, like the previous residents of Hafod ar Ynys. This act should be tabled within the first 100 days of this government. Will you bring forward the timetable, First Minister, and start the clock on saving thousands of lives?
Well, Llywydd, I will make a statement on the legislative programme before the summer break. It will set out our plans for legislation. It will inevitably have to attend to the continuing constraints which coronavirus places on us and the demands that it makes on our legislative services. We have not finished yet with Brexit legislation that the Senedd will have to find a way of dealing with. But nevertheless, I will set out the legislative programme. It will include our ambition to bring forward a clean air bill for debate in the Senedd. And Derek Jewell is right, Llywydd, that monitoring is an essential part of the way in which we can identify clean air difficulties and then marshal a response to them, as my colleague Leslie Griffiths did in relation to Hafod ar Ynys, confirming the plans that Cynhelir County Borough Council put forward to us and funding them in full. So, the record of this government in dealing with those clean air hotspots where monitoring has identified them, I think stands up very clearly to examination.
Cwestiwn 2, Natasha Ashka.
Thank you so much, Presiding Officer. First Minister, what action will the Welsh Government take to improve transport connectivity across Wales?
Llywydd, our strategy for transport connectivity across Wales is set out in the Wales Transport Strategy, yw'r newydd. For South East Wales, for example, this draws on the recommendations of the Burns Commission and its 58 recommendations, ranging from improvements on the South Wales main line to local measures.
Thank you, First Minister. Yesterday, I met with the representatives of Paragon ID, the leading provider of smart cards for transport and smart cities. They are responsible for providing smart cards for over 150 cities worldwide and were behind the Oyster card, as seen here in London. First Minister, it's a passion of mine to see an all-Wales travel card. I'm hoping to have a card just like this that will allow people from all socio-economic backgrounds and age groups to use this card. For example, a person could board a bus from their home in Newport to the railway station and then use the same card on the train to Swansea and get the bus from Swansea station, for example, to Swansea University. During our discussion, it became apparent that much of the technology for an all-Wales travel card is already in place, and all that is required to bring this about for the Welsh is for the Welsh Government to work with stakeholders and provide the investment. Establishing a Wales travel pass for use on local or sub-regional networks across all operators will ensure more seamless journeys for residents, tourists, commuters and students all across Wales, and ultimately encourage tourism, assisting visitors to travel easily and conveniently from north to south to east to West Wales. Will you, First Minister, commit to exploring the possibility of introducing an all-Wales travel card similar to the Oyster card here in Wales? And I promise you not to make you call it the Natasha Ashcroft travel card if you do.
Well, Llywydd, I congratulate the member on her appointment as the Transport spokesperson for the opposition and thank her for the ideas that she's explored this afternoon. While she was meeting her group yesterday, I was meeting a group of entrepreneurs from Cardiff who were promoting the idea of a Welsh card to me that they have been developing, which would have some of the same characteristics as the card that she has just outlined. So in principle, I think there is a great deal that is worth exploring in the ideas that the member has set out. I don't think it would be right for me to commit to a particular solution promoted by a particular company or groups of company, but she asks me whether I will commit to exploring the possibility of a card that would improve transport connectivity across Wales, and I'm very happy to give that commitment.
Mabon ap Gwynfor.
Os ydyn ni am gael rhwydwaith drafnidiaeth sydd yn addas ar gyfer yr unfed ganrif ar hugain, yna mae'n rhaid iddo wasanaethu y cerbydau fydd yn teithio ar hyd y ffyrdd hynny. Hyd yma, nid yw'r rhwydwaith yn addas i'r pwrpas hwnnw. Nid oes yna ddigon o bwyntiau gwefru heb sôn am orsafoedd hydrogen. Dwi'n nodi fod eich rhaglen ddeddfwriaethol fyddwch chi'n cyfeirio at nes ymlaen prynhawn yma yn dweud y byddwch chi'n creu sylfaen ddeddfwriaethol fodern ar gyfer trafnidiaeth yng Nghymru, ond does yna ddim manylion yn hynny. A gawn ni sicrwydd bydd yn rhwydwaith ffyrdd yn addas i bwrpas ar gyfer cerbydau newydd ac na fydd ardaloedd cefn gwlad yn colli allan ac gawn ni hefyd amserlen ar gyfer datblygu'r pwyntiau gwefru a gorsafoedd hydrogen fydd angen arno ni. Diolch.
Wel, diolch yn fawr i Mabon ap Gwynfor am y cwestiwn ac wrth gwrs dwi'n cytuno am y pwysigrwydd i creu pethau yn ei le ac yn y maes sy'n addas i ni am y dyfodol. Dwi ddim yn setio mas y raglen deddfwriaethol prynhawn yma. Bydd hwnna'n dod o flaen y Senedd cyn diwedd y tymor, ond i deddfu yn y maes bysiau a taxis yn enwedig yw rhywbeth sy'n wedi bod yn raglen ni cyn yr etholiad a dyn ni'n awyddus i bwrw mlaen i deddfu yn y maes na i helpu creu system am y dyfodol sy'n addas. A wrth gwrs ni'n feddwl am y cefn gwlad, dyna pam ni'n buddsoddi fel Llywodraeth mewn charging points. Yn y marn y Llywodraeth y Dynes Unedig, mae'n lan i'r fachnad i creu posibiliadau fel yna, ond ni'n gwybod bydd hwnna ddim yn mynd i digwydd dros Gymru gyfan os ni'n just yn dibynnu ar y fachnad private. Dyna pam ni'n buddsoddi fel Llywodraeth a ni'n buddsoddi yn y cefn gwlad hefyd.
Alun Davies.
Presiding Officer. First Minister, I think there's a very broad welcome for the £70 million that the Welsh Government is going to be providing to enhance the Ebble Valley line over the coming years. And in making this investment, of course, the Welsh Government is making good the failure of the United Kingdom Government to invest in these matters. And I think many of us would wish that the UK Government would spend as much on Welsh infrastructure as they do on their own press offices. We might be in a better position. First Minister, could you give us this afternoon an outline of the timescale for the enhancements that we hope to see on the Ebble Valley line? And could you also give me an undertaking that you and the Government will continue to campaign for the devolution of rail infrastructure to ensure that we will have the tools and the funds to do the job ourselves?
Well, thank Alun Davies for that, Llywydd. It was a matter of great disappointment to us that when the UK Government finally published its long-delayed response to the Williams review, that it made no mention at all in that response to the potential for future and further devolution of responsibility for rail infrastructure, as that was part of the original terms of reference which the UK Government itself set for the Williams review. But when it came to it, it chose to ignore that whole aspect, despite the fact that the Hendy review of union connectivity specifically says that devolution of transport responsibilities across the United Kingdom has been a success story. And the Hendy Review urges the UK Government to build on that success, and I look forward to that real test of the UK Government when it publishes its final response to the Hendy Review this summer. As far as the Ebu Valley line is concerned, I was very pleased that we were able to provide that £70 million to Blaenau Gwent Council. It will enable us, Llywydd, to move ahead with greater services for that part of Wales. From December of this year, a new hourly service will be brought about on the Ebu Vale line from Crosskeys to Newport, and the £17 million that we have provided will allow 2 trains an hour to operate on that line from Ebu Vale itself from 2023. So the plans are there to use that money to improve services in the way that the member has suggested, and to answer some of the questions already raised this afternoon, Llywydd, because not only will they bring better transport facilities to that part of Wales, but they will allow people to use an effective, convenient public transport system, leaving the car behind and adding to those benefits of clean air and other environmental improvements that we've already discussed today.
Cwestiynau nawr gan arweinwyr y pleidiau, Andrew Arty Davies, arweinydd y
Thank you,
Prif
Presiding
Weinidog.
Officer. First Minister, you've previously said that your government will not raise Welsh rates of income tax until at least the economic impact of coronavirus has passed. But you've also said that you will not rule out rising taxes before the end of the Senedd term. Will you be raising income tax at some point during this Senedd term?
Well, the member will have to wait to see. As we said in our manifesto, it will depend on the circumstances. While the economy is recovering, then there are no plans for this government to raise taxes in Wales, because we know that the recovery depends on making sure there's effective demand in the pockets of Welsh citizens to go out there, spend money and help with the economic recovery. The economic recovery which is underway, Llywydd, and there are encouraging figures out today on employment rates in Wales that demonstrate that that recovery is underway here. What lies beyond the recovery can only sensibly be decided in the circumstances that we will face when we get there. The member will understand that in the last 15 months we have gone through a period that none of us could have anticipated even 18 months ago, and yet he invites me to make decisions today for what will happen years into this Senedd term. It's not a sensible thing to do, and I won't be doing it.
Well, I think it's a perfectly reasonable question, since your programme of government does touch on income tax rates and whether the government will use them or not. Also, what's talked about are particular levies or surcharges for social care or indeed education, which was highlighted on the weekend by an academic here in Cardiff. So you have to pay for services some way, either through taxation or through levies or surcharges. So what is your preferred route then, First Minister? If you're not prepared to give an indication of what you're likely to do with Welsh income tax, do you believe that there should be a sector-specific surcharge on social care or indeed on education to help fund education with the deficit that we know exists in the education budget?
Well, so with my preferred route to paying for services in Wales is to grow the economy so that there are more buoyant receipts from an economy, so there is a bigger cake for us all to be able to use to pay for services. So that's where I start. I don't start as he does with asking about taxation. I begin by asking the questions about what we can do and what contribution the government can make to growing the Welsh economy and providing, therefore, the investments that are necessary. There is no mention in my party's manifesto of a levy for education, and that has no part in this government's plans. We did, in the last Senedd term, when we debated it extensively here, work on the Wholesome proposals for a social care levy to help pay for the demographic changes that we are going to see in Wales. All of us here know that the future in Wales is of an ageing population. We have a higher proportion of our population over 65 than any other part of the United Kingdom. We're the only part of the United Kingdom where people move into Wales at the age of 65 to retire, and we have to think together about how that is to be paid for in the future. The Wholesome proposals for a levy were a serious contribution to that debate, and we've done a lot of detailed work to see how that might work. It will only be able to work when we know the proposals of the UK Government, signalled briefly in the Queen's speech and promised by UK ministers before the end of this calendar year. Then we will be able to see the interface between any proposals of the Hotham variety or other ways of paying for social care and the benefit system which remains reserved to the United Kingdom. Only when we can see all parts of that complex jigsaw will we be able to make the most effective decisions about the way Welsh money can be used to pay for the social care services we will need in the future.
Well, First Minister, you will not indicate your use of income tax powers. You have indicated more clearly in your second answer the use of a social care levy, surcharge, call it what you will, and ruled out an education levy, surcharge, which I'm grateful for you doing that. But one thing your programme for government does talk about is a tourism tax, and actually consulting on the legislative proposals that such a measure would require to be brought in here in Wales. Can you indicate to me how you believe such a measure would help the tourism sector here in Wales when we know that high taxation actually impedes economic growth? I start from the position of low taxes encourage economic growth because they encourage people to go out, take the risks, take the challenges and grow that economy. But your programme of government clearly indicates that you're going to bring in a tourism tax. So how on earth will that help a vital sector of our economy repair itself after the COVID crisis?
Indeed. Well, so I look forward to bringing forward proposals for debate here in the Senedd on a tourism tax, an idea, as I heard my colleague Mike Hedges say, that has taken root and very successfully right across the globe and has been put forward by a series of local authorities of very different political persuasions in recent times, whether it's a Lib Dem-controlled Bath Council, whether it's a Labour-controlled Liverpool Council, or whether it's a Tory-controlled Aberdeen Council. There are proposals for tourism taxes at that level, and that is what the proposal in my party's manifesto is about. It is about giving the power and the authority to local authorities in Wales to make a decision for themselves as to whether or not a tourism levy would allow them better to go on investing in the circumstances that make those areas attractive to tourism. I'm very clear in my own mind, Llywyd, that a tourism tax properly done will benefit the industry, because what it will allow those local authorities to do is to invest in the things that make those areas attractive to tourists in the first place. At the moment, it is those local resident populations who pay for everything. They pay for the toilets, they pay for the car parks, they pay for the local museum, they pay for the local festival, anything that is put there to attract people into the area. It is those local residents who bear the cost in full. A tourism levy charged on people who choose to go to those areas in a very modest way, when you add it all up, could be a significant opportunity for local authorities to invest in the conditions that make tourism a success. Where local authorities don't believe that it would be a tool that they would seek to use, they'd be under no obligation to do it. But I've had many encounters on the floor of the Senedd with the Leader of the Opposition when he urges me to devolve, not simply to Cardiff, but onwards to local authorities to strengthen their ability to make decisions for their local populations. And that is what we will bring forward when we talk about a tourism tax. More powers for local authorities to make decisions that are right for their local areas and populations.
Ar ran Ple Cymru nawr, Rhina Piorwerth.
Diolch, Llywydd. Yng ngeiriau'r gweinidog dros newid hinsawdd, mae angen i Gymru wneud dwywaith gymaint i daclo newid hinsawdd yn y degawd nesaf ac yn ath i yn yr 10 mlynedd ar 20 diwetha. Y llynedd mi ddwedodd y Pwyllgor newid hinsawdd sy'n cynghori Llywodraethau'r Deyrnas Gyfunol bod absenoldeb strategaeth eglur i'r economi gyfan ar gyfer 2050 ar lefel Llywodraethau Cymru a'r Deyrnas Unedig yn golygu nad yw Cymru ar y ffordd i gyrraedd y targed o 80% heb sôn am net zero. Ac os edrychwn ni'n ôl, 31% mae allyriadau wedi gostwng yng Nghymru ers 1990 o'i gymharu efo 41% ar draws y Deyrnas Gyfunol. Pam ydych chi'n meddwl bod Cymru ar ei holi?
Wel, Llywydd, mae'n achos ni wedi cymryd o difri nifer o'r pwyntiau mae Ry'n Abioreth wedi wneud. Hwna yw y reswm. Ni wedi creu gweinidog ac adran newydd gyda'r y cyfrifoldebau i mynd i'r afael ar newid yn yr hinsawdd. Gweinidog gyda'r y pwerau yn y maes tai, egni, trafnidiaeth ac gyda'r ymgylchydd hefyd. So, yfory bydd y pwyllgor ar lefel y Denes Unedig yn mynd i cyhoeddi ar y droddiad diweddara ac ar dydd Mercher, fel Llywyd, ni'n gwybod chi'n ymwybodol, dydyn ni fel Llywodraeth ddim fel arfer yn rhoi pethau lawr ar yr agenda ar y dydd Mercher, ond ni'n wedi rhoi datganiad ar yr agenda am yfory i roi cyfle i'r aelodau i clywed oddi wrth y gweinidog newydd am y cynlluniau hi ac am yr ymateb a Llywodraeth i'r pwyllgor ac yr adroddiad diweddara.
Dwi'n croesawu'r ffaith bod yn y weinidog newid hinsawdd. O'n i'n gwrando ar y cyfweliad cyntaf wnaeth i ar y BBC. Yna lot o siarad am drafnidiaeth a ffyrdd, a mi fydd y Prif Weinidog yn gwybod mod i'n eiddgar iawn i annog symudiad tuag at gerbydau trydan a'r math yna beth. Felly mae hyn i gyd yn bwysig, ond mae adeiladau yn defnyddio mwy o ynni na trafnidiaeth. If we're serious about tackling climate change, we have to be serious about tackling energy use in buildings. And to cut emissions from heating in domestic premises, we have to replace fossil fuel burning boilers, and we have to invest in energy efficiency. And given that the majority of the housing stock, the vast majority of the housing stock in 2050 will be the inefficient housing stock that we have today, when are we going to see work beginning in earnest and at scale on the kind of retrofitting of heating and insulation needed to get us to where we need to go?
Well, look, I entirely agree, Llywyd, with the point that Ry'n Abioreth is making about the vital importance of a retrofitting programme. The Welsh Government will bring forward such a programme. We will invest significant sums in it because the energy that is given off by the houses we live in is one of the major challenges we face. It is also why we are so determined that the 20,000 new social renting houses that we will build will be houses that will generate as much energy as they use. And the investment that we made in the last Senedd term in our innovative housing programme has given us some really vital experience and information that we can use with real-life examples of housing being built in Wales that does exactly that, generates more energy than it consumes. Then that has given us a really solid platform from which we can build the sort of houses of the future that will contribute to the effort to address climate change rather than being another drain on it.
Perhaps worth looking a little closer at what you mean by significant sums. I think your government last November said you wanted, between now and 2050, to decarbonise 1.4 million homes. I think my sums, if they're right, say that's 132 homes every day for the next 29 years. And perhaps you can tell us how many Welsh homes were decarbonised last year, because from where I'm looking, it feels as if we're at a bit of a standstill. Retrofitting, of course, is an investment. It's an investment in the environment, but it's an actual investment also in making savings through energy efficiency. It could create tens of thousands of jobs. It's exactly the kind of project that could attract investment, real financial investment through government bonds. For example, and Plaid Cymru has talked of maybe a multi-billion pound scheme over a period of time, financed in that kind of way. Now, your government has had to admit that the £20 million invested in the optimised retrofit programme is, and I quote, not going to come anywhere close to decarbonising Welsh homes. Well, you can say that again. So, First Minister, it's more than 2 years now since the declaration of a climate emergency. We're something like 7% of the way to 2050 already. So when will you put the financial model and the detailed strategy in place to begin retrofitting at pace, because the clock is ticking and the emergency is deepening?
Well, Llywydd, again, I don't demur for a moment about the urgency of the crisis that we are facing. The Cabinet met yesterday and agreed a proposal from the Finance Minister as to how we will create the budget for next year over the summer and bring proposals to the floor of the Senedd in the normal way in the autumn, and that will be the way in which we will create the budgets that we need for the many, many different demands that there are on our public services. The one thing we will not be able to use, Llywydd, and I've had this discussion with the leader of Plaid Cymru in the last Senedd, is government bonds. Because government bonds do not add a single pound to the spending capacity of the Welsh Government. All they offer you is a different stream of funding to the funding streams we have already, and they don't add to it. They're just a different way of funding, and actually a more expensive way of funding much of the expenditure that we use. But in the system that we have, for every pound that you raise through a Welsh Government bond, you lose a pound of money that comes to us in capital expenditure from the UK Government. So it's not that they are a bad idea in themselves, and we've taken some steps to be able to create Welsh Government bonds, were they to be cheaper than borrowing money from the UK Government. But what they don't do is to add to the total amount of money that you can spend. And therefore, they're not an answer to some of the challenges that Llŷn has quite properly raised this afternoon. The sums of money that we have for the purposes for which we are responsible is fixed through the Barnett formula and the decisions that the UK Government make. I hope that the UK Government will be true to its commitment to climate change and everything that was said in Cornwall last week and in preparation for COP26. Then we will see the flow of investment through to Wales that will allow us to do more and to do more things more quickly, just as we would like to do.
Question 3, Gareth Davies.
Diolch, Llywydd. What assessment has the Welsh Government made of the impact that the pandemic has had on the ability to recruit future health and social care staff?
Thank the member for that question, Llywydd. The pandemic has vividly demonstrated the vital importance of health and social care services. This heightened awareness, positive changes in working practices and the development of new models of care all provide the basis to recruit future staff, joining the record numbers already employed by our NHS in Wales.
Thank you, First Minister. As you are no doubt aware, the UK Parliament's Health and Social Care Committee, in their damning report, stated that the NHS staff and care staff are so burnt out that the future of health and social care services are at risk. Whilst their report relates solely to England, I dare say things are not much better on this side of Offa's Dyke. Even before the pandemic hit these shores, our health and care staff were exhausted and overstretched. COVID-19 has only made the situation worse. Having worked in the sector for over a decade, I can tell you firsthand that many staff struggle to cope with the burden placed upon them due to staff shortages. Whistleblowers at the weekend spoke of the pressures managers place on staff to work longer hours. Unless urgent action is taken, more and more staff will be forced to leave. First Minister, what will your government do to ensure that we have sufficient staff working in health and care in order to reduce the burden on existing staff and ensure patient safety?
Well, I've no doubt at all that the pressures felt by our fantastic health and social care staff are very real. They have worked through one of the most difficult periods in our lifetimes, and they're now working equally hard to try and make up for all those things that have not been possible while dealing with coronavirus. And they're doing so now against the backcloth of the rising Delta variant here in Wales, with a realistic prospect that it will be sending more people back into the health and social care system. So I agree with what Mr Davies has said about the pressures that people have worked under. What are we doing to help address that? Well, we are employing more staff. At the start of the last Senedd term, there were 74,000 staff in the NHS in Wales. As we go into this term, there are more than 85,000 members of staff. Those are full-time equivalent of head count. It's well over 100,000. And that's more than 11,000 more staff in the NHS in a single term, and that at a time when his government in Westminster was cutting the budgets of the Welsh Government year after year after year. I see him shaking his head, but it's a simple matter of fact. A fact not denied by his government in England, who told us that austerity was something that was completely unavoidable. Despite that, we went on employing more staff in the NHS here in Wales. Over the last 6 years, we've increased the training places for physiotherapists by 44%, for nurse training places by 72%, for midwifery by 97%. Those people will come out of training, including the new medical school that we're committed to in North Wales, to make sure that staffing in North Wales has a particular focus. They will be available to work in the Welsh Health Service. They will join those extra staff that are already there, and they will help. They will help, and it's not a solution by itself, I understand, but they will help to address the impact that the last 12 months has had on our staff in health and social care, and help to lift that burden from them.
Sian Gwenllian.
Diolch Llywydd. Mae recriwtio doctoriaid yn parhau I fod yn broblem yn ardal y gogledd, fel da chi yn gwybod, efo gormod o lawer o arian yn mynd ar gyflogi locums ac gormod o lawer o swyddi gwag mewn meddygfeydd. A dwi'n falch iawn fod chi yn cefnogi galwadau cyson Plaid Cymru am ysgol feddygol y Mangor, a dych chi newydd gadarnhau hynny rwan eto, a bod hyn yn cael ei weithredu arno fo erbyn hyn. Felly, newch chi gadarnhau y galla'r ysgol feddygol agor yn y flwyddyn 2025 ymhen 4 blynedd, sef yr hyn mae'r Bwrdd Iechyd wedi ei gyhoeddi yn ddiweddar.
Well, Llywydd, as the member will know, there is a group that is chaired by Professor Elizabeth Treasure, the Vice-Chancellor of Aberystwyth University, and herself a very distinguished senior clinician in the Welsh NHS, to develop the plans for the medical school in Bangor. Stage 1 of their work is complete. Stage 2 of their work is being carried out at the moment. It involves the local health board. It involves professional representatives as well. It involves some other voices who will be directly involved in making sure that that project is properly completed and makes the contribution we all wanted to see to making sure that there are doctors and other members of the clinical team available in North Wales. The team plan to complete stage 2 of their work in July, and provided that it arrives in that way, I know that the Minister will look to make a statement to members here, drawing on their advice and setting out the timetable of the sort to which Sian Gwenllian has referred this afternoon.
Sarah Murphy.
It was a pleasure to visit the Princess of Wales Hospital in my constituency of Bridgend last week and meet with the incredible staff. They have been tremendous throughout the pandemic, and I know that everyone here today recognises, appreciates and thanks them for their bravery, for the sacrifices that they've made, and for their steadfast commitment to patient care. They and I welcome the Welsh Government's commitment to now addressing the waiting list for operations, particularly orthopaedic and ophthalmology, as well as the £100 million funding for our health boards to begin this vital work. As I know our First Minister is aware, in order to clear the backlog of surgical operations, we will need to have enough theatre staff to assist. However, there is currently a shortage of operating department practitioners, leading to a limit on the number of surgeries that can take place. Please will our First Minister tell us how Welsh Government will ensure that we not only attract enough ODPs to help clear the current backlog, but also ensure that we have a pipeline of them in the future for our Welsh NHS.
Well, Llywydd, thanks, Sarah Murphy, for that important question. She's right to highlight the key role of operating department practitioners within the surgical team. She will know from her visit to the Princess of Wales that the current challenge in operating theatres is not simply one of staff. It is also dealing with the restrictions that safe practice in the coronavirus context also require. She'll have heard, I'm sure, directly from staff about how theatres have to be cleaned thoroughly between every operation, as to how some procedures, where it was possible to have an operating list with 8 procedures in a day, can now only manage 3 in a day, even when fully staffed, because of coronavirus restrictions. Nevertheless, she's absolutely right to point to operating department practitioners as key. She will know that we have already announced an extra £100 million of investment in the health service here in Wales to help it with the recovery from the pandemic, and that is already helping to recruit additional theatre staff. But the member made another important point. It isn't simply recruiting more staff who are already trained, it's making sure that the training system in Wales produces the staff we will need for the future, and Health Education Improvement Wales has set out its plans to do that. It has ambitious plans to increase the number of not simply doctors, but all those other people on whom the health service depends, and operating department practitioners are amongst that number.
Cwestiwn 4, Darren Miller.
Llywydd, what action is the Welsh Government taking to improve road safety in Wales?
Thank the member for that question. We routinely monitor data such as personal injury collisions, road geometry and use by pedestrians and cyclists to inform the need for road safety improvements. We are also taking forward initiatives to roll out 20-mile-per-hour speed limits on restricted roads and tackling pavement parking.
Thank you for that answer, First Minister. The 27th of June will mark the 2nd anniversary of the tragic death of my constituent Olivia Alkeir. She was just 17 years old and was killed in a car crash on a rural Denbighshire road. As a result of that tragedy, Olivia's mum, Jo, and Olivia's best friend, Jo Hinchcliffe, started a campaign, the Olivia's Legacy campaign, to promote safer driving, particularly amongst first-year drivers. And their campaign includes the request for all first-year drivers to have telematics devices in their vehicles, which, as you know, can promote improved, safer driving. First Minister, we've managed to secure the support of the Chief Constable of the North Wales Police, Carl Fawkes, and many others on this journey with this particular campaign. And I appreciate that some of these things are not devolved matters. But can I ask, will you support now the Olivia Alkeir Legacy campaign to ensure that telematics devices can be something which we can encourage all young people to have in their cars in that critical first year after they've passed their tests, in order to avoid the awful tragedy that Olivia's family have suffered?
Well, thank Darren Miller for that. I do remember very well the very, very sad death of Olivia 12 months ago, and can only imagine the impact that that will have had on her family. And like so many families, they have, as Darren Miller has said, channelled their grief into trying to make sure that the same experience isn't shared by others. As far as I am aware, telematic services are not a responsibility devolved to us here in Wales, but I'm very happy to make sure that I look carefully at the work of the campaign. One of the things that we do fund as a Welsh Government is the Pass Plus scheme for young people. So it's free for young people in Wales who, having passed their test, can then go on to have a further 6 modules, as I remember, making sure that they don't think that just because they've passed their test, they're fit for all the challenges that driving on modern roads will face them. So very much want to associate myself with the general points that the member has made, and given an undertaking, I will look carefully at what the campaign is saying on the matter of telematics.
Peredur Owen Griffiths.
Diolch, Llywydd. Gwent Police covers the South Wales East region where I represent. In recent years, where they were the only police force to record a rise in road traffic accidents. A closer look at these figures shows that incidents where someone was seriously injured has more than doubled, from 82 in 2015 to 179 in 2019. I've been involved in a speed reduction campaign on the streets of Six Bells in Blaenau Gwent. Residents are worried that if something isn't done soon, somebody will be seriously injured before long. One of the barriers to introducing traffic calming measures is that a serious incident hasn't happened yet. We should be able to act before somebody dies. What can the Welsh Government do to streamline the process to enable communities like Six Bells to have more control over the traffic calming measures on their streets?
So I thank the member for the question. The annual police recorded road accident figures for 2020 will be published later this month, and we'll be able to take those into account in all local circumstances. I'm aware of the issue raised by the member because it's been mentioned to me previously by the Senedd member for Blaenau Gwent. The call for investment on safety in all roads is a very genuine one, but the only way we are able to respond to it is by an evidence base. And I know that that can be frustrating for some communities, but it's the way in which we're able to make decisions that are fair across the whole of Wales. And there is a very established way of doing that using the Go Safe Wales system, and that allows us to collect evidence on a uniform basis through the whole of Wales and then to make investment decisions according to where the need is greatest. I understand the frustration of local campaigners at that, but making decisions on investment in advance of the facts would only serve to disadvantage some other areas where the calls will be equally insistent and equally important to a local population.
Yw'r Davies.
Diolch, Llywydd. Fyddai'r Prif Weinidog yn cytuno â mi. Mae rhai o ffyrdd gorau o wella diogelwch ar ffyrdd o gostwng cyfyngiadau cyflymder mewn ardaloedd adaledig, creu ardaloedd di-draffig a rhoi ateb trafel yn gyntaf ar frig y pyramid teithio. Ond sut allwn ni sicrhau ein bod ni'n perswadio pobl i ddod gyda ni ar y siwrnau hon i ddyfodol tecach, gwyrdach a gwell? Sut ydyn ni'n ei wneud i'n haws i bobl wneud y dewisiadau doeth drosyn ni ein hunain, un cymunedau ac i'r planed hefyd?
Wel, diolch yn fawr unwaith eto i Hugh Davies am y cwestiwn. Dwi'n cytuno da fe. Mae'n un peth i'r Llywodraeth wneud pethau, Llywodraeth fan hyn, neu awdurdodau lleol, a mae lot o bethau ni yn gallu wneud, a mae lot o pethau ni'n mynd i wneud yn y dyfodol, ond mae'n rhywbeth arall i perswadio bobl i wneud y pethau ni gyd yn gallu wneud yn ein bywydau ni. Am fy marn ni, a ffordd pwysig, a ffordd fwy effeithiol i wneud yw trwy'r perswadio bobl, i roi popeth allwn ni wneud yn ei le i helpu nhw ac i perswadio bobl pan mae nhw'n teithio mewn ffordd sydd ddim yn creu newid yn yr hinsawdd neu yn yr amgylchaidd lleol. Mae nhw'n helpu. Mae nhw'n helpu eu teuluau, mae nhw'n helpu plant, mae nhw'n helpu y gymuned ble mae nhw'n byw. Ond pan ni'n gallu perswadio bobl i bihafio yn y ffordd na, mae nhw'n gallu wneud popeth mae nhw'n gallu wneud ac yn defnyddio y cyfleusterau mae'r Llywodraeth yn gallu rhoi yn ei le i helpu nhw.
Cwestiwn 5, Tom Gifford.
Diolch, Llywydd. Will the First Minister make a statement on council tax levels in Wales?
Llywydd, the average Band council tax in Wales for 21-22 is £1,731. Local authorities and police and crime commissioners in Wales are given the flexibility to set their annual budgets and council tax levels in order to reflect their local priorities. They are then accountable to their residents for the decisions they make.
I thank the First Minister for his answer. Council taxpayers in 2 councils in my region, Neath, Talbot and Bridgend, are forced to pay some of the highest rates of council tax anywhere in the UK. In both areas, they pay in excess of £1,900 per year on average for an abandoned property. We know that Welsh councils generally charge more on their council tax bills than their counterparts in England, and yet these councils have managed to set rates above that high average. I know in your programme for government, which has been published on the Welsh Government website today, you'll seek to reform council tax in Wales, which clearly based on these figures is long overdue. Therefore, can I ask you for the specific detail of how you'll achieve this to ease the burden of council tax on hard-working people across Wales?
It would help if the member's question were based on just a few simple facts, won't it? It is nonsense to say that council tax bills in Wales are higher than they are in England. The average Band D council tax in Wales is £167 a year less than the English average. The average rise in council tax in Wales for the current financial year is 3.8%. It's 4.4% in England. He gets his basic facts wrong, and it doesn't help the case that he wants to make. No doubt he will be welcoming the fact that Neath Talbot Council has agreed a council tax rise of 3.1% for its local residents this year, significantly below the level agreed, for example, by Conservative Monmouthshire. His residents are lucky, aren't they, to be living with a Labour council. Now, where I do agree with the member is that the system we currently have does not fairly distribute the need to fund local services. And we will bring forward proposals during this Senedd term to reform council tax, to make it fairer for Welsh citizens. That will not be an easy thing to do, because in any system that you look to make fairer, there will be some people who will have to pay more in order that those people less able to pay can pay less. And I look forward to his support when those proposals are brought forward.
Cwestiwn 6, Sam Rowlands.
Diolch, Llywydd. First Minister, what assessment have you made of the role of local government during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Llywydd, the significance of the part played by local government has quite rightly been highlighted during the pandemic. The partnership of Welsh Government, local government, private businesses and the third sector has been at the heart of our collective efforts to keep Wales safe.
Sam Rowlands?
Yeah, diolch, Llywydd. I was struggling with the mute button there. So thank you, First Minister, for your response to that point. And I too would like to praise the work of councils, specifically through this very difficult time of the pandemic. I know from my own experience, the sacrifice, hard work and dedication that council staff have shown through this crisis. And they, of course, deserve a lot of credit, right from our recycling crews, through to our librarians, social care workers, right through to our teaching assistants, all of whom have gone above and beyond. And in light of this exceptional demonstration of delivering for our communities, this again surely shows that rather than decision-making being withdrawn from local authorities into regional bodies through things like CJCs, that actually more should be decentralised and devolved from Cardiff to councils. So from aside from your previous reference to tourism tax, what plans do you have to show further commitment to our councils and communities by devolving more power and financial support to them?
Well, Llywydd, I begin by agreeing with what the member said about the tireless commitment of staff in local authorities right across Wales during the pandemic, and indeed to the leadership of those councils. Throughout the pandemic, we will have met leaders of local authorities in Wales at least weekly, sometimes daily, in order to make the very challenging decisions that were there for us to make in order to keep all parts of Wales safe. I think local authorities have demonstrated the significance of the part that they play in those local communities. I don't agree with what Mr Rowland said about the need for regional working between local authorities. And indeed, I've often thought that the way that the 6 local authorities across North Wales come together in the North Wales growth deal and in other aspects is a bit of a model for the rest of Wales as to how local authorities can operate on a regional footprint and therefore enhance the services that can be provided to local residents. And the legislation that was passed by this Senedd during its last term, I think, will underpin the efforts of those councils who look to make sure that by pooling their resources, sharing the solutions that they can develop, that they will all benefit as a result. It is an irony, Llywyd, isn't it, that earlier in the afternoon a proposal that the Welsh Government will bring forward to offer more powers and more choices for local authorities is being opposed by the leader of the Conservative Party, while I'm urged by other members of his party to do exactly that.
Cwestiwn 7, Jenny Rathbone.
What is the Welsh Government's timetable for introducing a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit in urban areas?
Following completion of the necessary statutory procedures, a national rollout to a default 20-mile-an-hour limit is planned for April 2023.
Thank you very much for that, First Minister. Clearly, it's interesting to see that there is a lot of interest in road safety in today's questions, as well as the impact on the air pollution and on carbon emissions. I just want to focus on the impact on children of speeding, because you say that persuading people is the most effective way of doing something about these things. But unfortunately, in my constituency, we have a significant number of drivers who think they have a God-given right to speed past school entrances, to not stop for pedestrians on zebra crossings, even when they are children, and also to park on prohibited zigzag lines that you often find around schools, as well as around zebra crossings. And that obviously means that doesn't help the fact that we have one of the highest child pedestrian death rates in Europe, closely following behind Scotland and Northern Ireland. So how does legislating for a 20-mile-an-hour limit in residential areas as the default, how will that be effective if we cannot change this culture of simply ignoring the law as it currently exists?
Well, so the member makes a number of very important points. Pedestrians are 5 times more likely to be killed at 30 miles an hour compared to traffic moving at 20 miles per hour. So decreasing speed reduces accidents and saves lives, and that is particularly important for children, as the member has said. We've talked about a series of interconnected things this afternoon in relation to air pollution and traffic. I could have said, and maybe should have said in my answer to the very first question this afternoon, Llywyd, that Clean Air Day in Wales on Thursday has as its main theme protecting our children's health from air pollution. And Darren Miller reminded us earlier of the very sad death of a young person in his constituency, and members will, I'm sure, be aware of the death of Ella Adu Kisi Deborah, a young child, where the coroner concluded that her death had been caused by the induction and exacerbation of asthma caused by polluted air in the town and street on which she was living. So these are very important points indeed that the member raises. I'm maybe not as pessimistic as maybe the very end of her question suggested about the possibility of culture change. Culture change always seems very hard, but in our own lifetimes we've seen it happen. When the very first Assembly sat after the elections in 1999, people smoked in offices, smoked in canteens, smoked in the bus on the way to work, smoked when children were present at the table, and now we wouldn't think, would we, of doing that. And this is only 20 years later. And I think had we said back then that we could change the culture of smoking in that way, we would have thought that was a pretty ambitious thing to have done. So I think culture change can happen, and it happens by a combination of efforts. As I said in my earlier answer to Hugh Ancaderis, I believe it best starts by persuading and encouraging people, even people who do very bad things, as the member said, around schools and so on. I don't think demonising people changes people's minds and doesn't change the way that they behave. We have to be able to make a case to them that doing something different is better for them and for the people that they care for. Then we need to take the sort of positive actions that I also referred to in an earlier answer. All the things that we are doing as a Welsh Government to create that infrastructure for active travel, to make public transport more available and accessible, and then we have to have enforcement. And we know that when people deliberately park on double yellow lines outside schools, causing the potential dangers that they do, then enforcement sometimes has to be the answer where persuasion has failed. So government action is important, but it's only part of the way in which we can make the culture change that Jenny Rathbone has referred to happen. And I don't think we should rule out, Llywydd, the possibility that public opinion may already be in advance of the appetite for political action in just the way that we saw with smoking, where I remember the debates here where there was a lot of fear that somehow we were ahead of where the public were, and the public turned out to be there before us.
Ac yn ola, cwestiwn 8, Altaf Hussein.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. What assessment has the First Minister made of alcohol-related deaths during the pandemic?
Can I thank Dr Hussein for that question? So, despite fluctuation, alcohol-specific deaths have remained relatively stable over recent years. Provisional figures suggest a rise in numbers in 2020, but more data is needed to confirm and to assess this. The reasons for any rise may be complex and will need additional analysis.
The First Minister will be aware that figures on alcohol-specific deaths only include those where each death is as a direct consequence of alcohol misuse, that is wholly attributable causes, for example, alcohol liver disease. Screening and referral system in general hospitals and seamless access to detoxification and residential rehabilitation services are the proven means of reducing such deaths by identifying those at risk of serious illness and providing services for their recovery from alcohol dependency. Does the First Minister agree with me that all health boards should report on the screening and referral systems in general medical departments to identify patients with an alcohol dependency, and will the Welsh Government commit to provide funding to ensure that all patients who need it have access to detoxification and residential rehabilitation? Thank you.
Thank the member for that supplementary question, and he's of course entirely correct that the figures that are published are direct causation of alcohol deaths, and the problem of alcohol misuse is a far wider one than that. On the final specific point that the member raised, the Welsh Government Rehabilitation Framework has 30 different providers of residential drug and alcohol services on it. Between April of 2020 and May of this year, there were 194 referrals to those centres, of which 93 were to Bryn Awel, a residential centre I know the member has a particular interest in. I was very pleased myself when Health Minister to visit Bryn Awel and to see the services that it provides. During 2021, the Welsh Government made available an extra £750,000 to support residential provision of alcohol and drug recovery services, of which $250,000 went directly to Brynawel to support additional placements there. So I know that he speaks with authority on this matter from the work that he does, and I hope that he will recognise the additional investment the Welsh Government has made and the difference that is making in the lives of people with alcohol dependency and their ability to access excellent services of the sort that Brynawel provides.
Diolch i'r Prif Weinidog. Yr eitem nesaf felly yw'r datganiad a chyhoeddiad busnes, a dwi'n galw'r